My golden boy brother, mocked my embarrassing startup at Thanksgiving. 6 years later, he applied for an entry-level job at my company. I need to preface this by saying I never in a million years thought I'd be writing something like this. But a friend told me stories like mine deserve to be put down somewhere. So here it is, the whole messy thing, start to finish, because I think I finally understand what actually happened to my family, and I want to get it out of my head before I convince myself to soften it into something more forgiving than it was. My name doesn't matter here, so I'll just call myself Danny, because that's close enough to what my family actually called me growing up, usually in that particular tone reserved for the disappointing one. My older brother, 4 years my senior, I'll call Grant, because it fits him, all sharp edges and self-importance, a name that sounds like it belongs on a building. Grant was the golden child from the moment I have any memory of either of us existing in the same house. He was valedictorian of a high school that took itself very seriously. He went to a university with an endowment bigger than some small countries, and he graduated straight into a mid-six-figure job at a finance firm downtown, the kind of firm that had its name etched into marble in the lobby and a dress code that cost more than my car. My parents, Richard and Carol, orbited him like he was the sun, and everyone else was just there to reflect a little of his light back at him. I went to community college. I studied graphic design, which in my father's vocabulary was somewhere between hobby and phase, and I freelanced for years after that, cobbling together logos and menus and wedding invitations for anyone who would pay me, sleeping on a futon in a studio apartment that smelled permanently like burnt coffee and printer ink. Every family dinner, every holiday, every casual phone call, there was this undercurrent, this quiet arithmetic where Grant's accomplishments got tallied out loud and mine got filed under still figuring it out, even when I was 26 years old and had been supporting myself for nearly a decade. I want to be clear that I didn't hate my brother. Not exactly. Not in the beginning. I think I mostly just wanted him to see me as something other than the family footnote. That wanting curdled slowly into something colder over the years, the way water turns to ice if you leave it out long enough in the wrong conditions. The turning point, the one that actually matters for this story, happened when I was 28. I'd been freelancing long enough to notice a pattern. Small business owners, the kind running a single restaurant or a boutique fitness studio or a family hardware store, desperately needed cohesive branding, a website that didn't look like it was built in 2004, social media that didn't feel like a ransom note cobbled together from stock photos, but they had no idea how to find or vet or afford the kind of full-service agency that could give them all. Of that under one roof. I saw a gap and I wanted to fill it. I spent months building a business plan in secret, staying up until 3 a.m. after full days of client work, mapping out service tiers and pricing models and a rough 5-year growth trajectory. Because I just knew, that if I brought this idea to my family half-formed, it would get torn apart before I even finished the sentence. I decided to call it Brightline Creative, because I wanted something that sounded like clarity, like a company that cut through the noise for people who didn't have the bandwidth to do it themselves. I brought the idea to Thanksgiving that year, naively thinking that maybe, finally, this would be the thing that changed how my family saw me. We were all sitting around my parents' dining table, the good china out, my mother's overcooked green bean casserole steaming in the middle like some kind of centerpiece, and I told them. I explained the concept, the market gap, the plan. I even mentioned I'd already lined up 2 interested clients on a trial basis. Grant let me get about halfway through before he started laughing, not a polite chuckle, a real laugh, leaning back in his chair like I'd just told the funniest joke he'd heard all year. He said, and I remember this verbatim because it's carved into me somewhere permanent, "That's embarrassing, honestly. You're going to burn through your savings trying to be some kind of one-man ad agency for nail salons, and you'll be back to freelancing logos for $15 an hour within a year. You watch." I looked at my parents, waiting for someone, anyone, to push back on that, and instead my father just kind of nodded along like Grant had made a fair and measured point, and my mother said something about how not everyone is cut out for that kind of risk, sweetheart, which somehow felt worse than if she'd said nothing at all. Nobody at that table asked me a single follow-up question about the business itself. Nobody asked what my projected margins looked like, or who my 2 trial clients were, or what made me think I could pull this off. They'd already decided the outcome before I'd finished my turkey. I want to skip ahead through the hardest part quickly, because honestly, it's not the most interesting part of this story, even though it was the most brutal to live through. I started Brightline Creative 3 months later anyway, out of pure spite as much as ambition, if I'm being fully honest with myself. The first year was miserable in ways I don't think Grant, with his salaried job and his benefits package, could have possibly understood. I was underwater on invoices half the time. I taught myself contract law from YouTube videos at midnight. I fired a subcontractor who ghosted a major deliverable and then had to pull 3 all-nighters in a row to save the account myself. I ate a lot of instant ramen and turned down a lot of social invitations because I genuinely could not afford them. There were at least 2 separate nights where I sat on my apartment floor and seriously considered calling it quits and slinking back to safe, predictable freelance work. But something about Grant's laughing face across that Thanksgiving table kept me upright. Somewhere around month 14, things started to click. I landed a contract with a regional chain of boutique gyms that needed a total rebrand across 12 locations, and that single contract was enough to let me hire my first full-time employee, a scrappy young copywriter named Priya who turned out to be one of the best hires I ever made. From there, it snowballed, in the way that good, sustainable businesses sometimes do when the timing and the product and the hustle all line up. By year 4, Brightline Creative had 12 employees, a real office in a converted warehouse space downtown with exposed brick and a wall of client awards, a roster of maybe 40 active small to mid-sized business clients, and 2 regional Best Emerging Agency awards sitting on a shelf in our lobby. I wasn't rich, not by Grant's old standards anyway, but I was stable. I was proud. And for the first time in my adult life, I felt like I had built something entirely mine that nobody could take credit for or laugh off. Around that same window of time, life was busy doing what life does, which is refusing to stay still for anyone, including golden children. Grant's finance firm went through 2 rounds of layoffs as the industry consolidated and automated more of what used to be entry-level analyst work. He survived the first round. He did not survive the second. I heard about it secondhand, through my mother, who called me sounding shaken in a way I'd never really heard from her before, telling me that Grant had been let go and that it was just a rough market, not a reflection of him. Which felt like the kind of thing you say to convince yourself as much as the person you're talking to. What followed for Grant, from what I gathered through fragments of family conversation over the next 3 years, was a slow, grinding humiliation that I won't pretend I didn't feel some ugly satisfaction watching from a distance. He applied to comparable roles and got nothing, or worse, got interviews that went nowhere. He tried consulting on his own and it fizzled within 8 months. He moved back in with our parents for a stretch, which I know aided him more than almost anything else could have, given how much of his identity had been built on being the one who'd made it out and made it big. My parents stopped bringing him up unprompted at family gatherings, which was its own kind of tell. I'd be lying if I said I reached out during any of this. I didn't. Some petty, wounded part of 28-year-old me was still very much alive in 34-year-old me, and I let the silence between us stretch out for years without doing anything to close it. Then, 6 years almost to the week after that Thanksgiving dinner, our hour coordinator, Melanie, walked into my office holding a printed resume with a look on her face like she wasn't sure whether she was about to tell me something funny or something I needed to sit down for. We had an opening posted for an account coordinator, an entry-level, client-facing role, answering emails, scheduling check-ins, doing the unglamorous groundwork that keeps an agency's client relationships running smoothly. It was the kind of role Grant, in his old life, would have considered beneath a college intern, let alone himself. Melanie set the resume on my desk and said, "This name looked familiar. I wanted to check with you before we moved forward either way." I looked down and saw his name printed right there in plain 12-point font. Applications submitted through our standard careers portal like he was any other candidate. No special note, no acknowledgement that we shared a last name and a childhood and 6 years of complete silence. I sat with that resume for a long time after Melanie left my office. I felt about 4 or 5 different things simultaneously, and none of them were simple. There was a genuinely petty, almost gleeful part of me that wanted to reject the application on principle just to feel the specific pleasure of being the one holding the pen this time, of finally getting to be the one who decides. There was another part of me, quieter but insistent, that was just curious, purely curious, about what had happened to him in those 6 years to bring him to the point of applying for a job like this at a company like mine. And underneath both of those, if I'm honest, there was something that might have been hope. The kind you're embarrassed to admit to yourself. Hope that maybe this was a door opening rather than a trap closing. I didn't make any decisions that day. I told Melanie to proceed with the standard process, phone screen first, same as any other applicant, and that I would sit in on it myself, which raised her eyebrows slightly, but she didn't push back. The call happened the following week. I remember staring at my phone for a solid minute before dialing, rehearsing absolutely nothing, because nothing felt like the right thing to rehearse. When Grant picked up and realized it was actually me on the other end of what he'd assumed would be a routine hour screening call, there was a long pause, long enough that I almost asked if he was still there. Then he said my name, quietly, like he was testing whether it was actually real. We talked for almost 40 minutes, way longer than a standard phone screen should run. He told me, without me having to pry much at all, that the finance industry as he'd known it had essentially cannibalized itself. Automation and consolidation eating through exactly the kind of mid-level analyst roles he'd built his entire career trajectory around. He told me he'd sent out over 300 applications in the past 3 years. He told me, and this part actually caught me off guard with how raw it was, that he'd been wrong, completely wrong, about what he'd said to me 6 years earlier, and that he'd thought about that Thanksgiving dinner more times than he could count since then. He said watching Brightline grow from a distance, mostly through Instagram posts and industry write-ups he had no business reading as closely as he apparently had been one of the more humbling experiences of his adult life. I didn't say much back. I mostly just listened, because some old, protective part of me still wasn't ready to hand him comfort that easily. Not yet. We moved him forward to an in-person interview, and I want to be honest that I debated recusing myself entirely and letting my hiring team handle it clean, without me in the room complicating things with family history, but curiosity won out over caution, same as it usually does with me. When Grant walked into our office for that interview, I almost didn't recognize him. The Grant I remembered filled out a room, wore suits that fit like they'd been poured onto him, radiated the specific confidence of someone who'd never once doubted his own trajectory. The man who walked in that day was wearing a suit that hung loose off his shoulders in a way that made it obvious he'd lost real weight. Not the gym kind of weight loss, the stress kind. He looked older than 6 years should account for. He was polite to the receptionist, polite to Melanie, and when he sat down across from me in the conference room, he didn't try to perform confidence. He clearly didn't feel anymore, which itself felt like a significant shift from the brother I remembered. About 20 minutes into the interview, once we'd covered the standard questions about client communication and organizational skills, I asked him the question I'd genuinely been most curious about, the one I'd been saving. What did he think was his biggest professional failure? I half expected a rehearsed answer about a specific bad trade or a missed deadline, the kind of sanitized failure candidates trot out because they think it makes them sound humble while still sounding competent. Instead, he sat quietly for a moment, and then he talked, really talked, about arrogance. About how he'd spent his entire 20s and most of his 30s assuming his degree and his starting salary meant he'd essentially solved the problem of his own career permanently. That he'd stopped adapting, stopped learning new skills, stopped taking seriously the idea that entire industries could shift underneath him while he wasn't paying attention. He said the layoffs weren't just bad luck, they were partly a consequence of his own complacency, and that it had taken losing almost everything to understand that. It wasn't the answer of someone trying to win an interview. It was the answer of someone who'd actually sat with his own failure long enough to understand its shape. I didn't make a decision right there in the room, even though some part of me already knew which way I was leaning. I spent the next week and a half talking it through with my leadership team and, more importantly, with my mentor, a semi-retired agency founder named Nathan, who I'd been getting coffee with every few months since Brightline's second year, someone who'd talked me off more ledges than I could count during the rough early days. Nathan's advice was blunt in the way I'd come to rely on from him. Separate the business decision from the family decision. Make sure you're not hiring him to punish him and you're not hiring him to rescue him. Hire him only if there's an actual business case, and if there is one, build in enough structure that the family history doesn't get to run the show. That conversation clarified something for me. Before I went back to Grant with any kind of answer, I asked him to meet me somewhere that wasn't the office, somewhere neutral, and we ended up at a small coffee shop a few blocks from Brightline. A place with mismatched chairs and a barista who knew none of our history and treated us like any other two guys arguing quietly over lattes. That conversation was the real one. The one the job offer had just been circling around the whole time. Grant apologized there, fully, without qualifiers or excuses, for what he'd said at that Thanksgiving table 6 years earlier. He told me that in hindsight he understood the mockery hadn't really been about me at all. It had been about him, about a fear he hadn't been able to name at 28. Watching his younger brother take a risk he himself had never once had the nerve to take, choosing instead the safe, prestigious, pre-approved path, and calling it superiority when really it was just the only version of success he'd ever let himself imagine. He said the jealousy had curdled into cruelty because it was easier than admitting he envied me. I sat with that for a long moment before I said anything back. Because 6 years of resentment doesn't dissolve in a single coffee shop conversation, no matter how sincere the apology is. But I could feel something in my chest loosen slightly, some knot I'd been carrying around without fully noticing its weight anymore. Here's the part of this story that I think matters most. The part that made the decision make sense to me beyond just family sentiment. I actually looked hard at what Grant could bring to Brightline, separate from all of it, and there was a real case there. Most of my design and creative team, myself included, were fluent in visual storytelling, but genuinely weak at translating that value into the language corporate finance departments actually respond to. Raw projections, cost per acquisition breakdowns, the kind of spreadsheet native reasoning that gets a creative proposal actually approved by a CFO instead of just admired by a marketing director. Grant, whatever else had gone wrong for him, still had that fluency baked all the way into how his brain worked. I decided to bring him on, but not directly under me, and not without real conditions. He came in on a 90-day probationary period, same as any external hire, reporting not to me but to our director of accounts, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Theo who had zero patience for anyone coasting on a last name, mine or otherwise. I told Grant explicitly, in that same coffee shop conversation, that inside the office he was an employee first and my brother a distant second, that I wasn't going to shield him from criticism or performance reviews, and that if it didn't work out professionally, I would let him go the same way I'd let anyone go. He agreed without hesitation, which itself told me something had genuinely shifted in him. What happened over that first year genuinely surprised me, and I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say it became one of the more quietly moving things I've witnessed in my professional life. Grant showed up early most days. He asked questions instead of assuming he already knew the answers, which from the old Grant would have been almost unthinkable. He took feedback from Theo, including some fairly blunt feedback early on about a client email that read, too formal and corporate for the small business owners we typically served, without a trace of the old defensiveness. He got along well with the rest of the team, including Priya, my first hire, who'd been skeptical of him at first, given everything I'd eventually told her about our history, and who later told me she'd been genuinely won over by how hard he worked to actually be useful rather than just present. Within about 6 months, his particular gift, translating our creative work into the financial language that larger prospective clients needed to hear before signing off on bigger contracts, started paying off in a very literal way. He sat in on a pitch for a multi-location restaurant group that had been on the fence for weeks, worried the rebrand cost couldn't be justified against projected returns, and Grant built out a clean, credible cost-benefit model on the spot that answered exactly the objections their CFO had been raising. We closed that account within the week, one of the largest contracts Brightline had signed to date. That wasn't an isolated case either. Over the following months, he helped close 2 more sizable accounts using that same instinct for bridging creative value and financial reasoning, something none of the rest of us had ever been able to do quite as naturally. The ripple effects went beyond the office, too. At family dinners, which I'd started attending again more regularly once things between Grant and me had thawed, I found myself, without any real premeditation, bringing up his work in front of our parents, mentioning the restaurant group account, mentioning how sharp his instincts had turned out to be, watching my father's face do something complicated when he heard it, something like reassessment. My mother, a few months into Grant's employment, asked if she could come see the office sometime, and when she finally did, walking through our space with its exposed brick and its wall of awards, watching Grant confidently walk a new hire through an account file in the next room, she got quiet in a way I'd genuinely never seen from her. Before she left that day, she pulled me aside and told me, with actual tears in her eyes, that she was sorry. Sorry for 6 years earlier. Sorry for not believing in me. Sorry for standing quietly beside Grant's laughter instead of beside me. I told her it was okay, though if I'm being fully honest, it wasn't entirely okay. Not completely. Some scar tissue like that doesn't ever fully smooth back out. But I appreciated that she said it out loud instead of letting it stay buried the way our family tended to bury everything uncomfortable. About a year into Grant's time at Brightline, an old contact from his finance days reached out to him about a director-level role back in the industry, a real opportunity, better pay than we could offer him, the kind of role his old 20-something self would have chased down without a second thought. He told me about the offer over lunch, and I fully expected him to take it, honestly assumed it before he even finished describing it, given the pay gap and the whole trajectory of everything that career had once represented to him. He turned it down. He told me, in a tone I'd genuinely never heard from him before, calm, unhurried, entirely certain, that he'd found something at Brightline he hadn't realized he'd been missing his whole career. Some actual sense that the work meant something beyond the number attached to his paycheck. That watching a small business owner's face light up when a rebrand finally started bringing in real customers gave him something no bonus at his old firm ever had. Looking back on the entire arc of this now, from that miserable Thanksgiving table to that lunch conversation, I think the biggest thing I've come to understand is that the revenge I used to fantasize about in my worst, most wounded moments, the kind where Grant would show up groveling and I'd get to slam the door in his face and feel, finally, vindicated, was never actually the thing that would have satisfied me. What actually satisfied me What actually settled something in me that had been unsettled since I was 28 years old at that dinner table was building something real and sturdy enough that I got to be the one who decided to extend a hand instead of a closed door, and getting to watch, up close, the person who once wrote me off completely rebuild himself into someone worth extending that hand to. I don't know if every story like this ends this cleanly. I suspect most don't. But I do know that the version of success I actually wanted, underneath all the old resentment, was never really about beating my brother. It was about becoming someone capable of forgiving him, on my own terms, in my own time, once he'd actually done the work to deserve it.